Good evening. My name is Caleb Hart. Tonight I'm going to be analyzing James Tucker, Natalie Lindrith, and Aaron Lynch's article, Why Should I Go Vote Without Understanding What I Am Going to Vote For? The Impact of First-Generation Voting Barriers on Alaska Natives. Tonight I'm going to be looking at 4 key areas. The first, Alaska, a Legacy of Discrimination. 2, Barriers. 3, looking at Section 203 and Nick versus Bethel. And finally ending with some conclusion. Let's take a look at the first section of the article, Alaska, a Legacy of Discrimination. Tucker, Landreth, and Lynch argue that through the primary patterns of historical discrimination, either intended or unintended, has led to a long-lasting barrier that has prevented the fair and equitable right to participate freely and fairly in state and federal elections. They argue that this unequal education opportunity, language suppression, and political exclusion have led to what they consider to be the, quote, first-generation voting barriers. They continue to go on and say that discrimination begets discrimination, and generations of students that grew up in this system are denied equal educational opportunities, where as a consequence, they were largely unable to read and write in English. Tucker, Landreth, and Lynch state that due to language suppression and unequal educational opportunities, Alaska Native voters require the enforcement of Section 203 for the Voting Rights Act. Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act requires all election material to be provided in voter-specific language. This can become one of many barriers for Native Alaskans. Tucker, Landreth, and Lynch provide 4 key barriers that prevent the free, fair, and equitable election process for Alaskan Natives. These 4 main areas are geographical barriers, linguistic barriers, voting practices, and limited enforcement of Section 203. They argue that Alaska is uniquely situated because of its large percentage of Native voters, and many of these Native Alaskan villages are roadless. And distance, travel, and weather conditions can often be a hindrance in the participation of elections. Physical separation from the Department of Elections can also compound linguistic challenges and the enforcement of Section 203. Tucker, Landreth, and Lynch argue that linguistic barriers always exist for Alaskan Native speakers. Oftentimes, English will be the only language provided on voting material, which can limit participation. Voting also requires a nuanced understanding of political issues and candidates, and translation can often become difficult. 6 voting regions have limited English proficiency required for all materials to be translated or read in native languages. Tucker, Landreth, and Lynch argue that 2 key voting practice issues present themselves as barriers: in-person voting and early voting. Tucker, Landreth, and Lynch explain that simple administration of in-person voting presents barriers. Alaska is unique in that it has roadless communities, and most of all of which are Alaskan Native villages. Administration is only compounded by the fact that many villages are divided by natural barriers and distance, and state law requires that in-person voting on election day take place between a.m. and close by 8 p.m. It's requiring all election officials to travel great distances between communities and speak several different languages when administering local elections in a single day. The article goes on to discuss early voting. While Alaska does offer early absentee voting 15 days before an election location, the location of that election is determined by the election official. Oftentimes, these elections occur in an urban setting or a non-native hub, with few rural hub communities. Finally, they argue that announcements of special elections were often made in English, limiting participation by traditional native language speakers. They go on to discuss the accurate translation of materials can present themselves as a barrier, as seen in Nick versus Bethel, and the lack of enforcement in Section 203. Section 3 discusses Nick versus Bethel and the enforcement of Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. Nick versus Bethel argued that the Alaskan Department of Elections did not provide accurate translation of all voting material and information to Alaskan Native voters. In 2006, in preparation for the renewal of the Voting Rights Act, Native American Rights Fund conducted an investigation that determined there was a, quote, wholesale failure to comply with Section 203. It stated in 3 key points that there was a failure to provide trained poll workers, no outreach for language assistance, and no Alaskan Native language translations of all material were provided in English. That included information about issues and candidates, or even a ballot itself. In 2007, they sued, alleging that Alaska and state officials failed to provide translations of all voting materials, assistance in voter registration, and that they failed to provide translated information about important election information. The results of Nick versus Bethel. The court determined that the state had failed in upholding Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act when it failed to provide translated information. The court went further in a claim that Alaska also failed in Section 208 when it failed to, quote, allow voters to bring individuals of their choice into the voting booth to assist them in the voting process. The court provided remedies such as fluent English and native language speakers working at poll locations, providing voters with a liaison to the tribal offices to ensure election language integrity, and to consult with tribal leaders to ensure the accuracy of all translated material. In conclusion, Tucker, Landreth, and Lynch argue that Alaskan Native voters will continue to face barriers, that the Voting Rights Act, and specifically Section 203, with the help of Nick versus Bethel, help to provide access to election materials, but that a fair election can only take place when an individual is provided opportunities to participate in the election in their own language. I'm left with the final thought of how will the current and future federal administrations uphold the Voting Rights Act? Will they strengthen the accessibility for Alaskan Natives to participate in elections fairly? Thank you so much for your time, and have a great evening.